My name is Rachel Voss. I am a colonel in the United States Army, but to my family, I have never been anything more than an inconvenience who happened to wear a uniform well. They didn't see a daughter who spent 2 decades earning her rank 1 deployment at a time. They saw someone who refused to shrink. Someone who didn't play by the family's rules, which were never written down but were enforced all the same. Smile more, talk less, and never under any circumstances make anyone uncomfortable by being exactly who you are. I hadn't spoken to my mother in any real way in almost 8 years. Not since my father's funeral, when I stood at the back of the reception hall in my dress uniform while my mother and my younger sister posed for photographs beside the casket like it was a milestone worth commemorating. Nobody introduced me to anyone that day. I was simply there, the way a coat rack is there. After that, I stopped trying. No holiday calls that lasted longer than 4 minutes, no visits, just the long, comfortable silence that we all, in our own way, preferred. Then, 3 weeks ago, an envelope arrived at my office at Fort Belvoir. Cream-colored stock, my name printed in a calligraphy font. Rachel Voss. No rank. No title. Just the name they used when they wanted to remind me how small I used to be in that house. The return address was my mother's home in Fairfax. The occasion was my younger sister Melissa's wedding. And the groom's name, printed beneath hers in the same elegant script, stopped my breath in my chest. Captain Ethan Cole. I set the envelope down on my desk like it had suddenly gained weight. I knew that name. I had pulled a soldier with that name out of a collapsed compound outside Kandahar 6 years ago. Half his leg pinned under a support beam, smoke thick enough to chew. I still have the scar on my left forearm from where the rebar caught me on the way out. I think about it sometimes when the weather changes. I didn't call my mother. I didn't call Melissa. I sat with the envelope for 3 days before I opened the smaller card tucked inside it, written in my mother's careful, deliberate hand. Please be gracious this time, that was all. No warmth. No, we'd love for you to be there. Just an instruction, the way you might speak to a dog that had once embarrassed you at a dinner party. I want to tell you that I laughed. I didn't. I sat very still in my office chair and looked out the window at the flag on the parade field, and I thought about every version of myself that had ever tried to make room for people who had never once made room for me. I thought about being 11 years old, standing in the doorway of my father's study while he explained, patiently, that girls who wanted to run around playing soldier usually grew out of it. I thought about being 17 and telling my mother I'd been accepted to West Point and watching her face rearrange itself into something polite and distant. The way you might react to a stranger telling you good news about a life you didn't particularly want to hear about. I thought about my father's slow, grudging pride once I made captain, pride he never once said out loud, only implied through the careful way he'd mentioned my rank to golf partners while never quite looking at me when he said it. And I thought about Melissa, 4 years younger, who had learned early and well that the way to stay safe in that house was to want exactly what our mother wanted for her, the right college, the right sorority. The right kind of quiet, agreeable ambition that never once threatened the shape of the family photograph. She wasn't wrong to learn that lesson. She was just the one who learned it, and I was the one who didn't. I don't think either of us ever chose our roles exactly. I think the house handed them to us before we were old enough to know we had a choice. That evening, Lieutenant Colonel Sam Okafor knocked twice on my open door and walked in without waiting for an answer, the way he always did. Sam and I had served together in 3 different postings over 15 years. He had seen me at my worst, bleeding, exhausted, furious, and he was the closest thing I had to family in the part of my life that actually functioned. He saw the envelope on my desk before I said a word. "That the wedding invite?" he asked. "That's the wedding invite." He sat down across from me, resting one ankle on his knee. "Your sister?" I nodded. "Marrying Cole, the one from Kandahar. The one from Kandahar." Sam let out a low whistle. "Have a support beam on his leg. You went back in for him after the second collapse warning." "I remember," I said. My voice came out flatter than I meant it to. We sat in that silence for a moment. The kind 2 people who've served together understand, where nothing needs to be said out loud to be understood. "You going?" he asked. "I don't know what they expect from me if I do. An apology. A performance. Quiet compliance so nobody has to feel anything uncomfortable at the reception." Sam leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Then don't give them any of that. Go because you choose to walk into that room. Not because they invited you, because you've earned the right to stand in it without flinching. I let that settle for a long moment. You're not going to ask me if I'm scared, I said. I already know the answer. He almost smiled. You're always scared before you do the right thing. That's how I know it's the right thing. That night, after Sam left, I sat at my desk and did the thing I actually knew how to do. I planned. Fort Belvoir to Fairfax was a 35-minute drive on a good evening. No flights, no terminals. Just me, my own car, and a road I used to bike down as a kid when I still believed my mother's silences meant she was tired, not that she was calculating. I RSVP'd yes. I told no one else. I didn't ask for an escort. I didn't request leave beyond the single weekend. Whatever I was walking into, I intended to walk into it on my own 2 feet, in my own vehicle, at a time of my choosing. 2 days before the wedding, in an apartment 40 minutes away in Alexandria, Captain Ethan Cole sat at his kitchen table with a printed guest list in front of him, a pen tapping against the edge of the page. He'd seen the name before, months ago, on a family tree Melissa had shown him half-jokingly while explaining who would be sitting where. Rachel Voss, my sister. Don't expect much, she's Army, always somewhere, very intense. He remembered going very quiet when he heard it. There had been a colonel, no, she'd been a major back then, who had come back into a burning structure for him when every voice on the radio was telling her not to. He remembered her call sign, not her full name. Things had a way of scrambling in his memory from that day, smoke and adrenaline rearranging the order of everything. But the name Voss had stayed lodged somewhere in the back of his mind for 6 years, like a splinter that never quite worked its way out. Is your sister's name Rachel? He'd asked Melissa carefully. Why? Just curious. Don't, Melissa had said. Not unkindly, but with a finality that ended the conversation. Not this week. I don't want to talk about her this week. He hadn't pushed. He told himself it was probably nothing. Voss wasn't an uncommon name, and the woman who'd pulled him out of that compound had never given her full one, just rank, and the promise that she wasn't leaving without him. Still, some part of him kept circling back to it, the way you circle back to a word on the tip of your tongue. He remembered the smoke most of all. The way it had turned the world a strange, thick orange, the way sound had stopped making sense. Voices flattened into a single roar, punctuated by the groan of a structure deciding whether or not it wanted to keep standing. He remembered the weight on his leg, the particular nauseating pain of it, and a voice above him, steady in a way, nothing else in that moment was steady, saying, I've got you, stay with me. I'm not leaving without you. He remembered a hand gripping his vest, the scrape of rebar, and then daylight. Blinding. Ordinary daylight, and a medevac crew shouting numbers he couldn't process. By the time he'd been stable enough to ask who had come back in for him, the answer he'd gotten was secondhand, garbled by exhaustion and painkillers, a major tall dark hair, already going through this program, and Wheelon's eye. No name, no face he could picture clearly enough to hold on to. For 6 years, that faceless major had existed in his memory as something closer to a fact than a person, a debt he owed and had no way to repay, because he didn't know who to repay it to. He'd told the story exactly twice, both times to close friends, both times ending the same way. I never even got her name. Now, sitting at his kitchen table with a guest list and a pen, he wondered if the universe had simply been waiting for the right wedding to hand him the answer. The morning of the rehearsal, I drove myself to my mother's house, taking the long way on purpose. Down the 2-lane road that used to be lined with the same dogwoods, past the elementary school where I'd once won a spelling bee my mother hadn't attended because she'd had a luncheon that couldn't be moved. I passed the hill I used to bike down at 12 years old, back when I still believed her silences meant she was tired rather than deliberate. I remembered flying down that hill so fast my stomach dropped, arms out, certain for those few seconds that nothing in the world could touch me. I hadn't felt that particular kind of certainty again until my first jump school qualification, 15 years later, the same weightless, reckless faith that the ground would still be there when I needed it. It struck me driving past that hill in a rental sedan, with my uniform hanging in a garment bag across the back seat, that I had spent my entire adult life chasing a version of that feeling in every place except the one where I'd first found it. I turned the radio off somewhere around the county line. I wanted to arrive clear-headed, not soundtracked. Whatever this weekend turned out to be, I didn't want to remember it filtered through someone else's song. I didn't knock right away. I stood on the walkway for a moment, looking at the freshly painted shutters, the trimmed hedges, the wreath on the door that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. Everything in its place, a shrine to appearances. When the door opened, my mother, Rachel Voss, stood there in cream linen, her hair pulled back into a twist so precise it looked engineered. She looked me over the way you'd inspect a delivery you weren't sure you'd ordered. "You came," she said. "I did. I hope you brought something appropriate." I brought my uniform. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Please don't make this about you, Rachel. This is Melissa's day." I held her gaze. "I know you know what I do, Mom. You don't have to pretend otherwise." She blinked, caught slightly off guard. "Of course I know, Colonel." She said the word like it cost her something to say it. "I just don't understand why you always have to bring it up." "I didn't bring it up. You did, by inviting the man I once dragged out of a burning building to marry my sister." She didn't answer that. She simply stepped aside and let me in. The house hadn't changed. Same lemon oil smell on the banister. Same chandelier in the foyer with one bulb burnt out, as if daring anyone to mention it. Even the silence felt rehearsed, like a stage set waiting for the audience to arrive. "You'll be at the Marriott on Route 50, my mother said, handing me a folded card with an address on it. "We thought you'd be more comfortable there, more privacy for you." I almost laughed. More privacy for me, or less proximity for her. Either way, I didn't argue. A hotel room I'd chosen for myself sounded infinitely better than a guest bed under this roof. "Rehearsal dinner is at 6, she added. "The country club on the river. Try to be on time." "I'm always on time, Mom." She didn't respond to that either. The rehearsal dinner took place at a private club overlooking the Potomac, the kind of place where the napkins were folded into shapes and every table had a printed card in flowing calligraphy. Mine read, R. Voss. No rank, not even a Ms., just an initial, tucked at a table near the kitchen entrance where the draft from the swinging doors kept the candle flames guttering. I sat down without comment. The room filled with light chatter, clinking glasses, my mother moving between tables like a stage director adjusting props. Melissa arrived 15 minutes late in a pale green dress, laughing before she'd even fully entered the room, glowing the way people do when they've never once had to wonder if they belonged somewhere. She hugged our aunt. She hugged 3 different bridesmaids. She got to my table last, and even then, her hug was brief, more obligation than affection. "You made it," she said. "I said I would." "Right, a beat. Well, glad you're here." She didn't sound glad. She sounded like someone reciting a line she practiced. An older woman took the seat beside me a few minutes later. Silver hair cropped short, posture like a plumb line, a simple gold pin on her lapel that I recognized instantly because I owned one just like it. Air Force. Retired colonel, judging by the insignia's shape. "Grace Lindholm," she said, extending a hand. "Old friend of your mother's from the garden club, if you can believe that. I used to fly refueling missions. Now I arrange peonies." "Rachel Voss," I said. "Army." I gathered. Her eyes flicked briefly to the set of my shoulders, the way I held my water glass, the economy of my movements, small things. The things you only notice in another person if you've spent years training your own body into the same shape. You carry yourself like someone who's used to being the only one in the room who knows what's actually happening. I almost smiled. Is it that obvious? Only to someone who used to be exactly the same person. She sipped her wine. "Your mother's mentioned you exactly twice tonight, both times in passing, both times followed immediately by a change of subject. I've known Diane a long time. She only does that when she doesn't know how to talk about something that makes her feel small." I didn't answer that right away. It was the first genuinely kind thing anyone in that room had said to me all evening, and it came from a stranger. "How long did you fly?" I asked instead. 26 years. Long enough to raise 2 kids who thought I was either a hero or a ghost, depending on the week. She looked at me sideways. "Which one do you think your family sees?" "Neither," I said. "I think they see an inconvenience that occasionally shows up in a uniform." Grace didn't laugh at that. She just nodded slowly, like she'd heard the sentence before, maybe even said it herself once, a long time ago. "My daughter didn't come to my retirement ceremony," she said after a moment, her voice quieter now, stripped of the polished small talk she'd used earlier. 26 years, and she had a work conflict. My son sent flowers." to the ceremony, like I'd died instead of retired. She turned her wineglass slowly by the stem, watching the light move through it. I used to think it was because they didn't understand what the job cost me. Missed birthdays, missed recitals, all of it. Then I realized they understood perfectly well. They just decided it was easier to resent me for it than to be proud of me for it. Pride takes more work. Resentment runs on its own. That's a hard thing to carry, I said. It got lighter, she said, once I stopped waiting for them to put it down for me. She looked at me directly then, and there was something almost maternal in it, though we'd known each other less than an hour. You strike me as someone still waiting, Rachel. I could be wrong. I didn't answer right away. The honest answer was that I didn't know anymore whether I was still waiting or whether I'd simply gotten so good at pretending I wasn't that I'd started believing my own performance. I used to think I came back here to prove something to them, I finally said. Lately, I think I might be here to prove something to myself instead, that I can sit in a room with them and not disappear. Grace nodded slowly, like that answer satisfied something in her. That's a better reason, she said. The first kind of proving never actually finishes. The second kind does. You'll know it when it's done. Across the room, I caught Ethan Cole watching me, not staring. Just a glance held a half second too long, the way you look at someone when a memory is trying to surface and hasn't quite made it to the top yet. He started to rise from his seat once, like he meant to walk over, and then Melissa's hand found his forearm, and he sat back down. I didn't think much of it at the time. I assumed it was simple curiosity, the mysterious sister finally seen in the flesh. I didn't know yet that he'd been carrying my name around in the back of his mind for 6 years, waiting for it to click into place. The rehearsal dinner ended without incident, which felt, in its own way, like a small victory. I drove myself back to the Marriott, changed out of my dress, and sat by the window with the lights of the parking lot below me, thinking about Sam's question from 3 nights before. What are you actually afraid of? Being humiliated again? Or starting to believe what they've always said about you? I didn't have an answer yet. I told myself I'd have one by the time the wedding was over. Melissa found me in the hotel's small lobby coffee shop the next morning, an hour before I was due at the venue for photos I hadn't been invited to be in. She was already half-dressed for hair and makeup, a robe over her slip, looking younger than I'd seen her look in years, less like a bride. More like the 14-year-old who used to sneak into my room during thunderstorms because she was afraid of the noise. I didn't know you'd be down here, she said, hovering near my table like she wasn't sure she was allowed to sit. Neither did I, 10 minutes ago. I gestured to the empty chair. She sat, cautiously, like the chair might change its mind about holding her. Ethan mentioned you again last night, she said, turning her coffee cup slowly on its saucer. After the rehearsal. He asked if I was sure you weren't the Voss from Kandahar. I told him I didn't know the details. I told him it wasn't really something we talked about in this family. That's true, I said. It isn't. I'm not trying to start anything, she said quickly. I don't know how to talk to you, Rachel. I never have. You left for the academy when I was 13, and every time you came back after that, you felt more like a guest than a sister. I didn't know how to ask you real questions, so I stopped asking any. It was, I realized, the most honest thing my sister had said to me in over a decade. I didn't know what to do with it exactly, so I told her the truth instead of something softer. You didn't stop asking because you didn't know how, I said. You stopped because it was easier not to. Same as Mom. I'm not angry about it anymore, not really. I just don't want you to tell yourself a story where it happened by accident. Melissa's eyes filled, and for a moment I thought she might actually cry, right there in the lobby, still in her robe, an hour before her own wedding. She didn't. She pressed her lips together and nodded instead, the way our mother did when she was holding something back by sheer force of will. I don't know how to fix 20 years in one conversation, she said finally. You don't have to fix it today, I said. Today's your wedding. Go be married. We can figure out the rest of it later if you want to. She looked at me for a long moment, like she was trying to memorize something. Do you want to? She asked. Figure it out later, I mean. I thought about lying, telling her what she needed to hear on the morning of her wedding. I didn't. I don't know yet, I said honestly. Ask me again after today. She nodded, stood, smoothed her robe, and for just a second, before she turned to leave, she reached out and squeezed my hand, quick, almost embarrassed but real. Thank you for coming, she said. I mean that. Even if I haven't said it right. The morning of the ceremony was bright, unreasonably beautiful, the kind of spring day Virginia does well, dogwoods in bloom, cardinals threading between the branches like the world's small apology for everything else that had ever gone wrong in it. I arrived early in my Class A uniform because I had decided the night before that I would not shrink myself into something more palatable for one afternoon. If I was going to sit in the back of a church again, I would do it as exactly who I was. The seating chart was posted near the entrance, printed on heavy cardstock, table numbers listed like assignments. I scanned it once, then again. No Colonel Voss. No Rachel Voss, not really, just near the bottom corner, added almost as an afterthought in blue ink, table 11, near exit. I didn't laugh, though some old tired part of me wanted to. My mother swept past a moment later in beige chiffon, barely breaking stride. "You're at 11, she said. "Quieter back there. Easier for everyone." I didn't reply. I walked into the sanctuary and took my seat near the rear, several pews back from where the rest of the family would sit. The pews filled slowly, perfume, pearls, the low hum of pleasant conversation. Bridesmaids fluttered near the altar. A photographer moved along the aisle, capturing candid moments that would later be printed and framed and hung on walls I would never be invited to visit. Ethan stood at the altar in his dress uniform, posture perfect, expression unreadable. Our eyes met once across the length of the church. Something flickered there. Not recognition exactly, more like the beginning of a question he hadn't yet found the courage to ask. I found myself studying him in that brief exchange. The set of his jaw, the careful stillness of a man who had learned the same way I had, to hold his composure in front of an audience regardless of what was happening underneath it. I wondered, watching him, whether he had any idea yet that the woman he'd spent 6 years unable to picture clearly was sitting 4 pews back in a church he'd chosen for his wedding. I wondered whether some part of him already knew, in the way the body sometimes knows things, before the mind catches up, a held breath, a held glance, a name that wouldn't quite let itself be forgotten. The organ shifted into the processional before I could think any further on it, and the room rose as one, the rustle of fabric and the soft creak of old pews filling the space where my thoughts had been. Melissa's entrance was, by every account, beautiful. The guests rose, the music swelled. She glided down the aisle like she'd been rehearsing for this moment, her entire life, which, in a way, she had. I stood with everyone else. I sat when they sat. I said nothing. When the pastor invited immediate family forward for a blessing, I rose out of pure reflex, muscle memory of belonging to something, even if that something had long since stopped belonging to me. My mother's hand found my forearm before I could take a step. Light, firm, practiced. "Not this part," she whispered. "This isn't about you." I sat back down. The blessing continued without me. Nobody in the church seemed to notice, or if they did, nobody said anything. I had spent enough of my life being the thing nobody mentioned in polite company that the silence didn't even surprise me anymore. It just settled over me the way it always had. Familiar, cold, and precise. I want to be honest about something here, because I think it matters more than the moment that came later. I sat back down and I chose to stay seated, not because my mother's hand on my arm carried any real force. It didn't, not physically, not really. I stayed seated because some part of me, the part that had spent 2 decades learning the difference between a battle worth fighting and a battle designed to exhaust you before the real fight even starts, understood that this particular moment wasn't the one to spend myself on. There would be a moment that mattered more. I didn't know yet what it would look like. I only knew with the same certainty I'd trust in the field, that spending my strength here would leave me with nothing left when it counted. That's not weakness. It took me years of service to learn the difference, and I don't expect anyone watching from a pew to understand it in the moment. But it's the truest thing I can tell you about that hour. I wasn't frozen. I was choosing my ground. The reception was held in a ballroom attached to the club, chandeliers throwing soft gold light over round tables draped in white linen. My table, 11, sat behind a column of white hydrangeas near the service entrance, where the waitstaff moved briskly with trays of champagne that never quite made it to my glass. Grace Lindholm found her way to my table again, uninvited by the seating chart but entirely welcome by me. "I switched my card," she said, sitting down with the unbothered confidence of a woman who had spent decades ignoring seating arrangements she disagreed with. "Diane will notice. Diane can survive it." "You didn't have to do that." "I know." She smoothed her napkin. "I wanted to." Across the room, at the head table, Melissa was radiant, laughing, refilling her own champagne glass with the ease of someone who had never once had to wonder if she was welcome anywhere. I watched Ethan glance toward our table twice during the meal, his expression tightening slightly each time, like a man working through a math problem he couldn't quite solve. Grace and I talked quietly through most of the dinner course, the kind of low, steady conversation that makes a crowded room feel smaller and more bearable. She told me about her years flying tankers out of a base in England, about a daughter who'd finally, after years of distance, started calling again once her own children were old enough to ask questions about their grandmother's old flight jacket hanging in the hall closet. Kids have a way of asking the questions the adults were too proud to ask, Grace said. My granddaughter wanted to know why Grandma got a medal. My daughter didn't have a good answer because she'd never let herself ask either, so she called me. First real conversation we'd had in 3 years, and it started because a 7-year-old wanted to know about a ribbon. Maybe that's the trick, I said, waiting for someone young enough not to know better than to ask. Maybe, Grace said, though she didn't sound entirely convinced. Or maybe you just tell the truth loud enough once that nobody gets to pretend they didn't hear it. I have a feeling you might get the chance to test that theory before the night's over. I didn't understand what she meant until later. At the time, I only laughed quietly and reached for my water glass, still empty from the waiter who'd passed our table twice without stopping. The toasts began around 8. Melissa's maid of honor spoke first, followed by Ethan's best man, a fellow officer who told a warm, unremarkable story about basic training. Then Melissa took the microphone herself, her champagne flute catching the chandelier light. To love, she said, voice bright and rehearsed. To family, and to the surprises that make a day like this memorable. Polite laughter. She let it linger, then turned almost lazily toward my table. Even my sister made it, she said, lifting her glass in my direction. All the way from wherever it is she's stationed these days, still guarding whatever mysterious doors need guarding, I assume. A ripple of laughter, soft, uncertain, the kind that comes from an audience that doesn't fully understand the joke but doesn't want to be the one not laughing. I felt Grace go very still beside me. Diane, standing near the head table, leaned toward 2 nearby guests and said, quietly enough that it wasn't meant to carry, but not quietly enough that it didn't. She's always liked making an entrance, even when nobody asked her to. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't cruel in the theatrical way that gets replayed in movies. It was worse, in its way. The practiced, careless dismissal of someone who has spent a lifetime perfecting the art of making another person feel small without ever raising her voice. I felt the old, familiar instinct rise in my chest, the urge to disappear, to make myself smaller so the discomfort in the room would pass more quickly. I had spent 20 years training my body to hold steady under fire. I did not understand, even now, why this particular kind of fire made my hands want to shake. Grace's hand found mine under the table, brief and steadying. You don't owe this room a single thing, she said quietly. Not your silence, not your patience. Whatever you decide to do next, decide it because it's true, not because it's easy. I nodded once. I didn't stand up yet, not because I was afraid, but because some part of me, the part that had spent 2 decades learning the difference between reacting and choosing, wanted to see what happened next before I moved. Ethan set his own glass down at the head table. I watched him say something quiet to Melissa, who frowned and shook her head, clearly telling him to let it go. He didn't let it go. He crossed the room instead. Not fast, not dramatic, just steady, deliberate steps through a sea of round tables and startled guests. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Someone's fork stopped halfway to their mouth. He stopped a pace away from my chair. Up close, I could see it happening in real time. The moment recognition finally clicked all the way into place. His eyes moved to my left forearm, to the thin, pale scar just visible below my cuff. "You're Voss," he said, quietly at first, almost to himself. Then, louder, steadier, "You're the colonel who pulled me out of that compound outside Kandahar." A few nearby guests actually gasped audibly. I heard my mother's breath catch from several feet away. "I didn't know for certain until just now," Ethan continued, his voice carrying now deliberately to the room. He straightened his spine, brought his heels together, and rendered a crisp, correct salute, the kind you only give to someone whose rank and record you respect without question. "Ma'am," he said. "Colonel Voss, I owe you my life, and I am ashamed it took me this long and this room to say so properly." He turned to face the guests, his voice steady, formal, unmistakably sincere. "This is my fiancé's sister, Colonel Rachel Voss, United States Army. 6 years ago, she went back into a collapsing structure under active threat to pull me out from under a support beam that had already crushed part of my leg. I would not be standing here today at my own wedding without her." The room had gone entirely silent, the kind of silence that has weight to it. Grace Lindholm rose slowly from her seat beside me. She didn't shout, didn't perform. She simply stood at attention, inclined her head with the precision of someone who had spent a career understanding exactly what respect was supposed to look like, and said, clearly, "Colonel." Nobody else stood. Nobody else saluted. There was no theatrical wave of veterans rising in unison. Just one woman who had earned the right to acknowledge another, doing exactly that and doing it correctly. It was enough. In some ways, it was more than enough, because it was true. Melissa's face had gone pale. Her champagne flute trembled slightly in her hand before she set it down, too hard, the stem clicking against the table. She didn't drop it, didn't shatter it dramatically. She simply sat very still, staring at the sister she had spent her entire adult life pretending didn't exist in any meaningful way. Diane's mouth opened. No words came out, just a small, broken exhale of my name. I stood, slowly, and let the silence hold for a moment before I spoke. "Thank you, Captain," I said to Ethan, keeping my voice level. "You don't owe me an apology. You never did. I'd have gone back in for anyone under that beam." "I know," he said quietly. "That's exactly the point." For a moment, neither of us moved, and the room seemed to hold its breath along with us. I was aware, distantly, of 100 small sounds returning slowly. A chair creaking, someone clearing their throat, the soft clink of silverware being set down by a guest who'd forgotten they were holding it. It was strange, standing in the center of all that attention after a lifetime of being arranged carefully out of the frame. Part of me wanted to sit back down immediately, to let the room's focus slide off me the way it always had. Another part of me, older, harder one, made myself stay standing a moment longer than was comfortable, simply because I had earned the right to occupy the space I was standing in. An older man at a nearby table rose next, unhurried, a retired lieutenant colonel I'd learn later, a distant cousin of Ethan's who'd served 2 tours in the same region I had years apart. He didn't salute. He simply raised his glass an inch off the table, a small private gesture of acknowledgement between people who understood something the rest of the room didn't, and said quietly, "Colonel," before sitting back down. It wasn't a wave of standing ovations. It wasn't theater. It was 2 people in a room of 100 who happened to know exactly what they were looking at, saying so plainly. That restraint, oddly, meant more to me than a crowd's applause ever could have. Applause is easy. Recognition, offered quietly and precisely by someone who understands its cost, is not. I didn't make a scene after that. I didn't need to. The room did the work for me. The murmurs, the recalculations happening behind 100 sets of eyes, the way people looked at my mother and sister differently, now not with judgment exactly, but with the particular discomfort of realizing they'd been laughing at a joke that was never actually funny. Someone near the back of the room had their phone out, the little red recording light blinking. I noticed it and, for a moment, considered asking them to stop. Then I decided against it. I'd spent so much of my life being erased quietly. I found I didn't have the energy left to protect the people who had done the erasing. Later, in the lobby of the club, my mother found me near the code check, her composure only partially reassembled. "You certainly made your point," she said, attempting a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I didn't make a point, Mom. Ethan did. I just stood there." She folded her hands in front of her, the way she used to when she was choosing her words carefully before a difficult conversation. "There's been some attention. Someone posted a video. People are asking questions about your service, about the family. That's not my problem to manage." "I'm not asking you to manage it," she said, a flicker of something almost desperate crossing her face. "I'm asking you to help us understand what to say." I looked at her for a long moment. "You want me to help protect the version of this family you spent your whole life building? The one where I don't quite fit?" Her eyes dropped. "It wasn't personal, Rachel. We just never understood what your career meant, what it cost you. We weren't prepared for." You understood, I said gently but without softening the truth. You just decided it was easier not to talk about it, not to ask, not to know me. That's different from not understanding, Mom. That's a choice you made, over and over, for almost 30 years. I read the citation, she said suddenly, quietly, like the admission had been sitting in her throat for years, waiting for the right amount of pressure to force it out. The one from Kandahar. Your father requested a copy, years ago, and never told you. I found it in his desk after he passed. I've read it more times than I'd ever admit to your face. That stopped me. You never said anything. What was I supposed to say? Her voice cracked, just slightly, the composure she'd built her entire adult life around finally showing a hairline fracture. That I was terrified every single day you were gone, and I didn't know how to be a mother who was frightened for her daughter's life without also being furious at her for choosing a life that frightened me. It was easier to be quiet. Quiet felt safer than either of those feelings out loud. It wasn't safer for me, I said. It just felt safer for you. She didn't argue. For the first time in longer than I could remember, she didn't have a rehearsed response ready. Do you hate me? She asked quietly. It wasn't the question I expected. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, and for just a moment, she looked less like the woman who had orchestrated this entire evening and more like someone who was, belatedly, afraid of the answer. No, I said. I don't hate you. I stopped waiting for you a long time ago, though. Those aren't the same thing, but I think they might feel similar from where you're standing. I turned to leave. She called after me once, Rachel, but I didn't stop walking. Some conversations end not because every word has been said, but because both people have finally run out of reasons to keep having them. I drove back to the Marriott alone that night, windows cracked, the cool spring air moving through the car. I didn't cry, though I thought I might. I mostly just felt quiet, the particular hollowed-out quiet that comes after carrying something heavy for a very long time and finally setting it down, even if only partway. My phone buzzed twice on the passenger seat. Sam, checking in. How'd it go? I thought about how to answer that honestly. It went the way it needed to, I finally typed. Not the way I expected. Better, in some ways. Harder, in others. Proud of you, he wrote back. Get some sleep, Colonel. He called an hour later anyway because Sam had never once in 15 years trusted a text message to carry the weight of an actual conversation. I picked up on the second ring. Tell me the parts you didn't put in the text, he said without preamble. So I told him. The seating chart. The hydrangeas blocking our table from the rest of the room. My mother's whisper that wasn't quite quiet enough. Ethan crossing the ballroom like it was the most natural thing in the world to walk toward the truth instead of around it. Grace standing, saying one word, sitting back down like she hadn't just rearranged the entire emotional architecture of the evening. And Melissa? Sam asked. How'd she take it? Like someone watching a building she designed turn out to have a structural flaw she never wanted to find. I said. She didn't say anything. I don't think she had anything ready. For once in her life, I don't think my sister had a rehearsed line waiting. Sam was quiet for a moment. You did good, Rachel, not because you got some big dramatic win, because you didn't perform anything. You just stood there and let the truth do what truth does when you finally stop covering for the people who benefit from it staying hidden. I didn't do it for a win, I said. I don't even know what winning would look like in a situation like this. I know, Sam said. That's exactly why it worked. I did sleep, eventually, though it took a while. I kept replaying the moment Ethan crossed that ballroom. Not the salute itself, but the steadiness in his face as he did it. The simple fact that a man who barely knew me had been willing to spend social capital he didn't have to spare at his own wedding because the truth mattered more to him than the smoothness of the evening. I thought about Grace Lindholm's single word, Colonel, and how much more it meant, coming from someone who understood exactly what it cost to earn, than 100 shouted accolades from people who didn't. I thought too about Melissa's face in that last moment before I left the ballroom. Not anger. Not even embarrassment exactly, but something closer to grief. The particular grief of watching a story you've told yourself for years collapse in front of witnesses. I didn't feel triumphant about that. I want to be honest about that too. I felt something closer to sad, the way you feel when a long illness finally gets diagnosed, relief that the truth is finally visible, mixed with grief for how long it was allowed to go untreated. I didn't sleep easily that night, not because I regretted anything, but because dismantling 20 years of careful avoidance in a single evening leaves a kind of static in the body that doesn't clear quickly. I lay awake for a long while listening to the hum of the hotel's air conditioning replaying, not the salute, not my mother's whisper, but the quieter moment beforehand. Melissa in her robe in the lobby coffee shop, asking if I wanted to figure it out later. I hadn't had an answer for her then. Lying in that hotel bed, I still didn't have a complete one. But I noticed, for the first time in longer than I could remember, that I wanted to find one. That felt like something worth paying attention to. The small video clip did make its way online exactly as my mother had feared. It wasn't a viral sensation, not really, just a modest wave of attention on a military family page. Then a short pickup by a small defense-focused outlet that ran a 2-paragraph piece with the headline, "Groom Salutes Bride's Estranged Sister at Wedding. Turns out she saved his life." No dramatic Pentagon press conference, no national headlines. Just enough truth, moving through enough hands, that it could no longer be quietly rewritten by anyone who wanted a tidier version of events. I didn't give any interviews. I didn't correct anything. I let the truth exist without narrating it further because I had already spent one evening being someone's punchline, and I had no interest in becoming someone's headline instead. 2 weeks after the wedding, I requested a transfer, not out of the Army, not into some quiet retirement, but into a role I'd been quietly considering for over a year, an instructor position at the Command and General Staff College training the next generation of officers, many of them women who reminded me in small ways of who I'd been at 24, capable, uncertain, still learning how much space they were allowed to take up in a room. Sam laughed when I told him, "Took you long enough to admit you actually like teaching." "I like teaching people who actually want to learn," I said. "Turns out that's rarer than you'd think." On weekends, I started something small. Nothing with a formal name, no national press release, no foundation with a marble plaque. Just a standing Saturday morning meetup at a coffee shop near base, open to any service member who needed to talk about the particular, under-discussed wound of being estranged from family because of the uniform they wore. Some weeks it was 3 people, some weeks it was 12. Grace Lindholm came most weeks, usually with a plate of something homemade, usually the first to speak when the silence in the room got too heavy. "We don't have protocols for this kind of injury," I told the group once in the second month. "Nobody hands you a manual for what to do when the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally treat your service like an embarrassment instead of an honor. So we're going to write our own, slowly, together." Nobody clapped. Nobody needed to. It wasn't that kind of room. In my classroom at the staff college, I had a second lieutenant that spring, sharp, capable, visibly exhausted in the particular way of someone carrying more than coursework. Her name was Priya Anand, and she stayed after class one Thursday, hovering near the door the way people do when they want to say something and haven't decided yet whether it's worth the risk. "Can I ask you something not related to the syllabus?" she said. "Always. My parents didn't come to my commissioning," she said, the words coming out fast, like she'd been holding them for weeks. "They wanted me to go to law school. They still introduce me to people as working for the government, like I'm filing paperwork somewhere instead of—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "I saw that video. From your sister's wedding. Someone in my unit sent it to me last year. I didn't know it was you until I saw your name on the class roster." I sat down on the edge of my desk, the way I did when I wanted a conversation to feel less like a lecture. "Does it get easier?" I asked, guessing at the question underneath her question. She nodded, embarrassed, like I'd caught her at something. "Not easier," I said honestly. "You get stronger at carrying it. That's different, and it's slower, and some days it doesn't feel like enough. But it adds up. One day you'll be standing in a room that used to make you feel invisible, and you'll notice you're not shrinking anymore. That's not nothing, Lieutenant. That's most of the work, actually." She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, quietly, "Thank you for saying that instead of just telling me it'll be fine." "It might not be fine," I said. "But you'll be fine. Those aren't the same thing, and you're allowed to hold both." She left with something looser in her shoulders than when she'd walked in, and I sat at my desk a while longer, thinking about how many versions of that same conversation I'd had over the years without ever once having anyone have it with me first. Melissa reached out about 10 months later, not with a grand apology, not with a carefully worded statement designed to repair her own image, but with a short, uncertain text message that arrived on a Tuesday evening while I was grading essays at my kitchen table. I don't really know what to say. I've been thinking about that night a lot. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I just wanted you to know I'm trying to understand what I did. I read it twice. I didn't respond right away. I thought about my mother's question in the lobby that night, "Do you hate me?" And I thought about how strange it was that neither of them had ever asked me a real question until the illusion they built had finally, publicly cracked. I didn't write back that night. I saved the message instead, the way you save something you're not ready to answer yet but aren't willing to delete either. A week later, I sent a short reply. Not forgiveness. I wasn't there yet, and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise for the sake of a tidy ending. Just 4 words, honest as I could make them. I appreciate you asking. It wasn't closure. It wasn't the kind of dramatic reconciliation people sometimes expect from stories like this one. It was smaller than that, and truer for being smaller. A single door left unlocked, not thrown open, not bolted shut either. Just unlocked, in case either of us ever found the courage to walk through it. We met for coffee, finally, about 4 months after that first text. A quiet place near Old Town. Nothing like the country club, nothing like the ballroom. Melissa arrived first, and I watched her through the window for a moment before going in, the way you sometimes study a person you love and don't fully understand at the same time. "I've been seeing someone," she said, once we both sat down with our drinks going cold between us, "a therapist. I started after the wedding. I didn't know how to tell you that without it sounding like I was asking for credit. You're not asking for credit by telling me the truth," I said. "That's just telling me the truth." She turned her cup a quarter turn, an old nervous habit I recognized from when we were kids. I keep thinking about that toast, what I said. I've replayed it so many times trying to figure out why it felt funny in my head and cruel out loud. I think, she stopped, started again. I think I needed you to be small that night, because if you weren't small, I had to ask myself what that made me for going along with it my whole life. It was, I thought, the closest thing to real self-awareness I'd ever heard from anyone in that family, including myself, on my harder days. "I'm not going to tell you it's fine," I said. "It wasn't fine. But I believe you're actually trying to understand it, and that matters more to me than an apology would have, honestly." Apologies are easy to perform. This is harder. "Is it enough?" she asked. "To start again, I mean, slowly." "I don't know yet," I said, echoing the answer I'd given her that morning in the hotel lobby, months earlier. "But I'm willing to find out." That's more than I could have said a year ago. She smiled then, not the practiced camera-ready smile from the wedding, but something smaller and more uncertain, more honest for being uncertain. We didn't solve 20 years of silence over 1 cup of coffee, nobody does, but we made a plan to do it again the following month, and the month after that, and slowly, carefully, we started building something neither of us had a name for, yet not quite what we'd had as children. Not quite strangers either, something new, built on purpose this time, instead of inherited by accident. These days, when my mother says my name, and she does, occasionally, in the brief, careful phone calls we've started having again, she says it differently than she used to. She pauses before the rank now. She measures the word colonel like she's not entirely sure she's earned the right to use it, and in a way, she hasn't. Not yet. Trust doesn't rebuild itself just because the truth finally got loud enough to be heard. But she says it. That's new. That's something. I think about Grace sometimes, about the way she stood up in that ballroom. Not dramatically. Not for an audience. Just because it was true, and she was the kind of person who said true things out loud when it mattered. I think about the young officers in my classroom who ask sometimes, half joking, half serious, whether it gets easier being the one who doesn't quite fit the shape your family expected. I tell them the truth. It doesn't get easier exactly, but you get stronger at carrying it. And eventually, if you're patient, and if you're lucky enough to find your own Ethan Cole, your own Grace Lindholm, your own Sam Okafor, people who see you clearly and say so, without being asked, the weight starts to feel less like a burden and more like proof. Proof that you never once let them make you smaller than you actually were. I didn't need the whole world to see that ballroom moment to know it was real. I didn't need a foundation with my name on it, or a headline, or an apology written with a publicist's help. I just needed one true thing said out loud in a room full of people who had spent years pretending not to know it. That's the quiet kind of justice I've learned. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. It just settles into the room and stays there long after everyone else has gone home. Sometimes, on the Saturdays when the coffee shop group is small, just Grace and me and maybe one nervous young lieutenant working up the courage to speak. I think about how strange it is that the whole shape of my life bent around one wedding I almost didn't attend. If I'd stayed home that weekend, if I'd let the note in that cream-colored envelope win, I don't know that I'd have ever said any of this out loud to anyone. I don't know that I'd have found Grace, or built the Saturday mornings, or sat across from a second lieutenant and told her the truth instead of a comfortable lie. I don't say any of this to suggest that estrangement is a gift, or that every family wound eventually resolves itself into a tidy lesson if you just wait long enough and wear the right uniform to the right event. Some of the people in my Saturday group never get the version of that ballroom moment I got. Some of them are still waiting and may wait for years for a family that never quite arrives at the honesty mine eventually did. I don't have a neat answer for them other than the one Sam gave me on the night I first opened that envelope. Go because you choose to. Build the life that's actually yours, regardless of whether the people who were supposed to hand it to you ever show up to see it. My mother and I are not who we once were to each other, and we are not, yet, everything I might once have wished we could be. We are something quieter than either of those. Two women, slowly, imperfectly, learning how to sit in the same room without either of us having to disappear. Some weeks that feels like enough. Some weeks that doesn't. I've stopped expecting it to feel like enough every time, and that, more than anything else, might be the real proof that I've healed. I still have the scar on my forearm from Kandahar. I still touch it sometimes, without thinking, the way you touch any old wound that's finished healing but never quite finished mattering. I used to think of it as a mark from the worst afternoon of my career. These days, I think of it differently, as the thread, however unlikely, that eventually led a room full of strangers to finally see me the way I'd always seen myself. Not because a man saluted me at his wedding. He simply said, out loud, in front of witnesses, something that had always been true. That's all any of us are really asking for in the end. Not applause, not spectacle. Just one true thing, spoken plainly in a room that finally can't pretend not to have heard it.